Well, it's Monday, the 4th of January, the first normal working day of the year. I've just listened minutes ago to Boris Johnson's statement to the nation, and we are going back into a full lockdown in England. Parliament will debate this and vote on it on Wednesday. The Labour Party support it, so there's no question it's going to happen. And indeed, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland very much in the same place. Listen carefully to what Boris Johnson had to say. The schools will be closed until the mid-February half-term, by which time he said, if all goes well, and there's a following wind, people over 70 and those that are vulnerable will have received the vaccine. But he said it takes 3 weeks for that to really kick in. So he hopes the schools can go back shortly after that date. Effectively, what he's saying is that we're locked down until early March if things go well. Now, one of the arguments for this is, of course, the soaring number of people testing positive. But perhaps what really worries him is there are 40% more people in hospital as COVID cases right now than there were back at the peak of this over 6 months ago. And yet, the Nightingale hospitals, apart from the one in Exeter, haven't taken a single patient, and the one in London at the Excel Centre has no equipment in it either. If this was really about NHS beds, then why on earth have we spent a couple of £100 million on Nightingale hospitals that now are not even there to be used? And look, we can argue about lockdowns, because it does seem to me that lockdown doesn't really work because it isn't stopping the virus. But the fact is, there's nothing any of us can say or do about this lockdown that is going to make any difference. Their minds are made up. They believe this is the right strategy. However, when it comes to rolling out the vaccine, and it is good news that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was given out today, particularly good news as it only costs £3 per dose. So for a few £100 million, you can vaccinate the whole country, compared to the 22 billion that's already been spent on test and trace, which clearly at the moment doesn't work very well. But here's a thought. If we're going to roll out vaccinations at a level of 2 million a week, and we're placing the responsibility for this in the hands of the National Health Service, in the hands of the quangos like Public Health England, perhaps we need some fresh thinking. Perhaps we need a different approach, because it seems to me that's the only way we're going to get out of this misery. And I say misery because I felt profoundly depressed by what Boris Johnson had to say today. I think, in fact, it looks like the most depressing early winter since 1941, since 80 years ago when our big cities were experiencing the Blitz. We've had bad winters, we've had terrible weather, but nothing quite as awful as the prospect of being locked down until March. So we have to have a different approach. Are we really going to trust the same people, the same cabinet ministers who made such a mess of testing in the early days, who have not got test and trace right, whose almost every promise they have failed to deliver upon? Or is it time to think about a different approach? Now, what I'm about to say, I think is going to surprise you. Because there was one man that I listened to last week on the radio, saw on the television, who said something that really impressed me. He said, rather than waiting for each person over the age of 80 to have 2 inoculations, which would improve their level of immunity, that second dose would improve their level of immunity by an extra 5 to 10%. Wouldn't it make more sense to vaccinate a much greater number of people? Even if the immunity rate was that bit lower, you would have spread it out and extended it to a much larger chunk of the population. And I listened to this argument being made, and I thought, you know what? This really makes sense. And the power of the argument that was put forward was so strong that actually Jonathan Van Tam in the Mail on Sunday has now gone with the same line. It's now become government policy. Interestingly, this person also said, we've got to think way beyond just the National Health Service, just the establishment, the medical establishment as it currently exists. and we've got to draft people in to get this to work. Now, of course, we're in a national crisis. No one can deny that. This is a very serious national crisis. And that means you've got to think differently. It's not 1941. It's not a war. But it is a time to have a government and to have people leading it who've got genuine talent, even if they disagree on many other policy matters. I've heard tonight calls for people like Jeremy Hunt to perhaps come back into the cabinet. And I understand that because this cabinet is the most inexperienced, the most low grade I've ever seen in my lifetime. I mean, you know, these people don't command any respect at all. I won't mention their names tonight. You've heard me do it on previous videos. I do not agree with so much of what Tony Blair stood for. Not just Iraq, Europe, many other things. But you know something? It was Tony Blair that made those arguments about the vaccine. It was Tony Blair that said, give one jab to each person, not two, and we can then get a bigger part of the population dealt with quickly. It was Tony Blair advocating not hundreds, but thousands of centres where we can get people to get the vaccine. I mean, goodness me, we could even be doing it at motorway service stations. We were doing it everywhere. We should, at a time of national emergency, use the standing army that we've got. We need to rapidly increase the pace of this. Otherwise, my real fear is that effective lockdown won't end in early March, won't end at Easter. It'll be May or perhaps even later before we get there, particularly if these ministers who've handled this crisis so badly carry on as they are. If ever there was a moment to call for a government of all the talents, much as I don't like Tony Blair, he does get things done. He does command respect. He is seriously bright. Why not get people like Tony Blair involved to help us solve a national crisis? We have absolutely got to up the pace of vaccinations. Otherwise, I fear for so many millions of men and women running their own businesses. I fear for those that need diagnoses for cancer, heart disease, and much else. And I particularly fear for those living on their own, now being told that effectively we're all back living under house arrest. So it's going to be tough. The last time we had lockdown, we had the most amazing spring weather we've seen in 50 years. It's pretty grim and sleety outside at the moment. But I suppose we could always watch the television, couldn't we? Or did you watch it over Christmas? Did you watch it over New Year? I was amazed to be personally attacked by Nish Kumar as the moment of 11 o'clock and Brexit approached. I was astonished by the tone of Sky News, of the BBC, as if some terrible impending doom was coming as the moment of our final Brexit approached. We were told, of course, there would be massive traffic congestion in Kent and in Calais, and it's turned out those threats were about as serious as the millennium bug 20 years ago, because all the freight is operating perfectly smoothly. So in desperation, I turned on New Year's Day onto BBC Two. It was the feature-length film of Dad's Army. Oh, I know I've watched it before, but I thought it might give me a bit of light relief, so I put the television on. And before the film played, a BBC announcer warned me that in this film there would be anti-discriminatory language. So I turned it off. I mean, we can't watch television, we can't leave the house, we're in for a tough old time. I had promised myself that I was going to do, and I have been doing, dry January. But if there's nothing to watch on TV and nowhere to go, I'm not so sure I'll last too long.